Behind the Door. Chapter 1. I've been unhappy many times in my life, as a child, as a boy, as an adult. Many times, if I consider it, I've touched what are called the depths of despair. And yet I can recall few periods blacker for me than the months from October 1929 to June 1930, when I had just started upper secondary school. The years lived since then have not in the end been of any use. I haven't managed to remedy the suffering which has remained there like a hidden wound secretly bleeding. To cure it? To be rid of it? I don't know if that will ever be possible. From the first days there, I had felt out of place and deeply uneasy. I didn't like the classroom where they had put us, at the end of a dark corridor, such a far cry from the happy and familiar one onto which opened the 13 doors of the lower school classrooms, which were divided into 3 lower sections and 2 higher. I didn't like the new teachers, with their aloof, ironic manner that discouraged any warmth, any friendly relations. They used the formal address with all of us, even when it didn't actually threaten that in the immediate future we'd be subjected to regimes almost as harsh and severe as a prison, as was the case with Guzzo, the Latin teacher, or that woman Kraus, who taught chemistry and natural sciences. I didn't like my new companions, who had come from 5A, and with whom we of 5B had been amalgamated. They seemed so different from us, maybe cleverer than us, better looking than us, and from better families than ours. They were, to sum up, irremediably foreign to us. And so I could neither understand nor condone the behaviour of many of our own, who, unlike me, had quickly sought to make common cause with them, rewarded, as I noted, with consternation by a reciprocal warmth and an equally easy-going acquiescence. How could that be possible? Even conceivable, I wondered, with discontent and jealousy. My keeping of the faith crudely offended even on the first day of school, when I caught sight of Meldolesi, our beloved fifth form literature teacher, disappearing into the distance at the head of his new fourth form down the school corridor. From now on, a forbidden place where we could no longer set foot. My absurd faith would have wanted an invisible line of demarcation to continue, keeping apart the remainder of the 2 old fifth forms, even at upper school, in such a way that we of the B class would be protected and safeguarded from any betrayal, from any contamination. But the event that undoubtedly embittered me most was that Otello Forti, the old friend I'd shared a desk with from primary school, hadn't managed to pass the 5th form exam. I myself, the year before, had to retake mathematics in October, but he, although earlier he had only had to retake English, had been failed definitively that October. Not only did I now no longer have him seated as ever on my right, but I couldn't even meet him outside at the school gates at midday to walk back along the Corso della Giovecca together, each of us going to our respective homes, nor could I meet him at the Montagnone to play football in the afternoon, nor at his house, most of all, his lovely, big, happy house, full of brothers and sisters, of boy and girl cousins, where I had passed the greater part of my adolescence. Since Otello, poor thing, unable to bear his unfair failure, had got his father's permission to repeat the 5th year at Padova in a boarding school run by the Barnabite order. Deprived of Otello, no longer able to enjoy his massive, slightly obtuse presence at my side, his body so much bigger and heavier than mine, no longer to be stimulated or even goaded by the gruff, ironic, but still affectionate reserve with which he always deployed at my expense, whenever, either at his house or mine, we did our homework together. Right from the start, I'd felt that persistent pain, the inconsolable emptiness of the bereaved. What did it matter that he wrote some letters to me from Padova, in which, with an eloquence that astonished me, I'd never have him pegged as very intelligent, he pointed out all his affection. What did it matter that I replied to him with no less affection? I was now at upper school, he was stuck in lower school, I was at Ferrara and he at Padova. This was the insuperable reality which he, with the courage, unexpected clear-sightedness and maturity of all defeated souls, showed himself even more aware than I was. I wrote to him, "We'll see each other at Christmas." And he replied that, yes, at Christmas, some 2.5 months off, perhaps we would meet again, on condition he obtained, as he swore to himself he would, the right grades in all his subjects, something that was by no means certain. But anyway, 10 or so days spent together wouldn't really alter the situation. He seemed to be suggesting, "Go on, forget me. If you haven't made another friend yet, go out and find one." No, writing to each other achieved very little. So little, in fact, that after the holidays at the beginning of November, after All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, then Armistice Day, by unspoken agreement, we gave up altogether. I needed to vent my unhappiness, to show it. So, on the first day of school, I made sure that I didn't join the usual stampede to grab the best desks, the ones closest to the teacher's podium, at which, at the beginning of every year, my school companions would launch themselves. Leaving this battle to the others, to ours and to theirs, I held back at the doorway of the classroom to observe the scene with distaste, and in the end went so far as to sit down there by the window on the furthest corner desk reserved for the girls. It was the only seat left unoccupied. A big desk, ill-adapted to my less than average size, but perfectly befitting my intense desire to be in exile. Who knows how many slovenly failures and year repeaters it had been host to before me, I thought to myself. I read on the tarry surface of the tilted desktop all that had been carved by the penknives of my predecessors, mainly invectives against the whole teaching body. but especially against the headmaster, Turolla, nicknamed Half-Pint, and the look I then cast round over the 30-odd heads and necks bent over in an orderly fashion in front of me filled me with acrimony. My recent failure in maths still riled me. I was in a hurry to re-establish myself, to be considered once again one of the best and brightest pupils. And yet, for the first time, I understood the perspective of the idlers in the back row. School seen as a prison, the headmaster as its warden, the teachers as its guards, and my school companions as fellow jailbirds. A system, in short, which any eager collaboration should be resisted, while every chance to denigrate and sabotage it should be embraced. Those waves of anarchic scorn that, with a touch of fear, I'd felt surging from the back of the class since primary school, how well I now understood them. I scanned the scene before me and disapproved of all and sundry. The girls, humiliated by having to wear their black smocks, as a group amounted to nothing, just little girls. The 4 who occupied the first 2 double desks, all of whom came from 5A, with their tight pigtails swaying on their slender backs. They seemed like kiddies from the kindergarten. What were they called? Their surnames all ended in ini. Bergamini, Bolognini, Santini, Scanavini, Zaccarini. That sort of thing, which brought to mind with their diminutives the most petit bourgeois of families, milliners, delicatessen shopkeepers, bookbinders, council employees, and so on. The 2 girls at the 3rd desk, Cavicchi and Gabrielli, the first very fat, the second bony and skinny with the pallid, spotted face of a 30-year-old spinster, represented what remained of 5B's females, hunched and greyish, undoubtedly the 2 ugliest girls, destined to work as pharmacists or schoolmistresses, and to be reckoned as mere objects, things. The remaining 3 girls, disposed on the 4th and 5th desks, Balboni and Giovine on the 4th, and Mainoia alone on the 5th, came from outside the city. Balboni from the countryside. You could see that clearly enough from the way she was dressed, poor thing. Her mother might well have been the village dressmaker, a position acquired without exacting qualifications, and likely it was her who had constructed those dresses. And Giovine came from Potenza, Manoia from Viterbo. These 2 were probably part of the retinue of low-grade civil servants or railway employees transferred to northern Italy as a reward for special merit. How sad and boring. Was it some kind of rule that girls who continued their studies always had to look like this, dejected, characterless crones who didn't even wash that often, judging by the odour of mould that wafted from them, while beauties such as Legnani and Bertoni, for example, the 2 vamps of 5B, were promptly failed. But Legnani and Bertoni couldn't have cared less. The former was, it seemed, about to get married, with her wasp waist, her short, shiny black fringe, and those wicked eyes like the starlet Elsa Merlini's. Fat chance that she'd repeat the fifth form. She was the type to slink off to Rome to become an actress, as we'd often heard her say. She wasn't likely to rot away behind the door of secondary school. But it was the boys who were the main target of my criticism, especially the two pairs who occupied the desks in the centre row facing the teacher's podium. Down there in the first and second desks, 5A had planted all of 3 whole interlopers, Boldoni, Grassi and Droghetti, beside whom in the second desk sat Florestano Donadio from 5B, who seemed an uninvited but tolerated guest, abject as he was in his physique, in his studies, in everything. The son of a cavalry officer with that irreproachable and stupid look of his that convinced you he was sure to follow exactly in his father's footsteps, Droghetti was certainly a mediocrity. But the two in front, Boldini and Grassi, among the brightest and best of 5A, together represented a real force, and the small-statured, rosy-cheeked and blonde Donadio, wee, timorous creature that he'd always been, had evidently offered himself as their assistant and vassal. Another baleful combination sat in the third row, Giovannini from B and Camurri from A. For the sake of clarity, it wasn't that Giovannini was any worse than the other. Despite coming from the country, the good Walter even managed to speak a reasonably convincing Italian. But Camurri was upper class, ugly, short-sighted and sanctimonious, but upper class. His family, who didn't know of the Camurris of Via Carlo Maier, was among the richest in the city. They owned hundreds of hectares in the Codigoro area, precisely in that part of the country from which Walter came, so it wasn't at all unlikely that his grandfather and father had once been, or even still were, in service to the Camorri household. In the fourth row alone, who knows why, unless it showed that no one had sufficiently aristocratic lineage to be beside him, sat Cattolica, Carlo Cattolica, who from primary school onwards had always been the undisputed genius of the A class, regularly receiving top marks in every subject. Although it might seem improbable, it was no sweat for him to communicate, if need be, with the no less trusted Boldini and Grassi in the first row via the dependable backs of Camurri and Droghetti leaning over their desks in front of him. It was a marvel to behold how they managed this in Greek and Latin classes. Messages were passed from the fourth row to the first, and vice versa, with the same ease as if they'd had a field telephone at their disposal. Behind Cattolica, two of ours, Mazzanti and Malagù, two nonentities, more or less. And on my right, leaning over their desks with the sole aim of ducking down and escaping the eagle eyes of the teacher as much as possible, sat Veronesi and Danieli, the first at least 20, and the second even older, a pair inured to continually repeating the year, veteran slackers, useless even at sport, and for years regular frequenters of brothels. And even if the places in the row of desks closest to the door, those in front of the blackboard, seemed a slightly better assortment. In the second desk, Giorgio Selmi had ended up next to Chiregatti. In the third, Ballerini had managed to place himself once again with the inseparable Giovanardi. How could I resign myself to be paired with Lattuga in the first desk, the wretched, stinking Lattuga, who throughout his days at school had rarely found anyone willing to sit beside him? And this year too, like Cattolica, though for completely different reasons, had remained all alone. No, no. Far better the solitude of the place I had chosen in the row of girls. Bianchi, the Italian teacher, had begun his series of lessons by declaiming one of Dante's Canzone, and one verse had especially struck me. The exile imposed on me, I hold as an honour. That could have been my banner and motto. One day I was distractedly looking out of the big window to my left at the glum courtyard inhabited by starved cats, which separated the Guarini school building, an ex-convent, from the side of the Gesù church. I was thinking that after all it would have been good if, for example, Giorgio Bassani, who had always seemed at heart a likeable boy, had taken the initiative on the first day of school to ask me to share with him. Selmi was an orphan whose father and mother were both dead. He lived with his brother Luigi at the house of his paternal uncle, the lawyer Armando, a grumpy bachelor of about 60 who couldn't wait to be rid of his nephews, having found a place for one of them in the military academy at Modena and the other in the Livorno Naval Academy. And yet why on earth had Giorgio preferred to put himself behind that grim hunchback Chieregatti rather than me? His uncle's apartment in Piazza Sagrati, legal offices next to a few rooms that served as living quarters, certainly wouldn't have sufficed for the two of us to do our homework in, if it was true that he, Giorgio, had to study in his bedroom, a broom cupboard of barely 3 by 4 meters. By contrast, at my house, we would have had all the space we needed at our disposal. My study was big enough for me, him, and whoever else might have wanted to join our partnership. Besides, my mother, delighted that I was now spending my afternoons at home and not at Forti's house, as I had done at lower school, would have brought us who knows what splendid snacks at 5 o'clock, accompanied by tea, butter and jam. It really was a shame that Giorgio Bassani hadn't chosen to pair up with me. No doubt this was a result of envy, of jealousy. My home was too fine and comfortable compared to his, and then I had a mother and he didn't. All he had was a scurvy old uncle. Every now and then, anti-Semitism didn't come into it. Tss! The slightest of whispers coming from the right made me start. I spun round. It was Veronese. Hidden behind the shoulders of Mazzanti, he was indicating with an incredibly nicotine-stained first finger that I should look in front of me. What on earth was I doing? He seemed to be saying, with something between amusement and concern. Where the hell do you think you are, you crazy idiot? I complied. In the absolute silence, barely marred by 1 or 2 giggles, the whole class was looking at me. So too Professor Guzzo, up there on his master's chair, fixing me with a sneer. Finally, he said sweetly. I stood up. Your name? I stammered out my surname. Guzzo was renowned for his unpleasantness, an unpleasantness which bordered on the sadistic. Round about 50, tall, Herculean, with eyes of radiant blue beneath a Wagnerian brow, and long grey sideburns extending halfway down his bony cheeks, he passed for a kind of genius at the Guarini. The epitaph for the fallen in 1915-18, Mors domuit corpora, vicit mortem virtus, so prominently placed at the entrance, had been his work. He wasn't a member of the fascist party, and this was the reason, this alone, as everyone said, that he had been unable to secure the university post, to which various of his writings on philology, published in Germany, should most certainly have entitled him. "Excuse me," he said, cupping his ear in his hand and leaning forward over the open register. "A little louder, if you wouldn't mind." He was having fun. That was clear. He was enjoying himself. I repeated my surname. He sat back abruptly and looked intently at the register. "Good," he concluded, while making a mysterious mark upon that document. "And now tell me something of yourself, sir," he continued, settling back in his chair. "Me? You? Obviously. From which of the two fifth form classes do you come? A or B?" "B." His lip curled. "Ah, from B. Good. And how do you come to be here? With one flying jump, or, forgive my feeble memory, could it be something to do with a second attempt?" "I've got to retake maths in October." "Just maths?" I nodded. "You are quite sure that you haven't to retake a wretched, if functional expression, any other subjects? Latin and Greek, for instance?" I shook my head. "You are absolutely sure about that, are you?" he went on with feline meekness. Again I nodded. "Well, pay attention, dear chap. Pay attention. I would hate that in addition to maths, your good self should be obliged this summer to have to take Latin and Greek, amounting, quod Deus avertat, to 3 subjects. You do understand me, don't you?" Then he asked me how I was getting on at school, and if I'd ever had to repeat a year, but he was no longer looking at me. He was looking around as if he didn't trust me and wanting any volunteer to speak out. "He's extremely good, one of the best," someone finally dared say. Possibly Pavani, up there on the first desk in the first row. "Ah, one of the best," exclaimed Professor Guzzo. "And therefore, if seen at school as one of that small band of the elect, how come this falling away? How could this possibly be?" I didn't know what to say. I stared at the desk. Not that the answer to Guzzo's question was going to come to me from that blackened old wood. "How could this be?" he went on implacably. "And for what reason did you choose that seat? Perhaps to be close to the admirable Veronese and the no less admirable Danieli, wishing to learn from them rather than me true knowledge. The class broke into laughter. Veronese and Daniele too, although with lesser enthusiasm. No, you listen to me, Guzzo continued, stilling the confusion with a broad gesture, like a conductor. First of all, you are going to have to change places. He looked around, assessed, and summed up. Here, at the fourth row, next to that gentleman. He pointed out Cattolica. And you, what is your name? Cattolica got to his feet. Carlo Cattolica, he said simply. Ah, excellent. The renowned Cattolica. Excellent, excellent. You're from Class A, isn't that so? Yes. Excellent, excellent. A and B together. Very good. I gathered together my books, made my way up the aisle, and reached my new seat, sent on my way by an outburst of coughing from Veronese, and was met with a smile from the champion of Class A. Give me your full attention, Cattolica, Guzzo was saying. I'm entrusting him to you. Lead this lost sheep to tread once more the paths of righteousness. Chapter 2. I have absolutely no idea what became of Carlo Cattolica in these last 30 years. He's the only one of my school companions about whom I know nothing, what career he took up, if he ever married, where he lives, or if he is still alive. I can only say that in 1933, after he passed the final school exams with the highest marks, he had to leave Ferrara to move to Turin, where his father, an engineer, a little bald chap with blue eyes, maniacally dedicated to opera and stamp collecting, browbeaten by his maths teacher wife, who was a whole head taller than him, had unexpectedly been given secure employment in, I believe, a paint factory. Did Cattolica, the son, become an important surgeon, as he had predicted since the beginning of 1930, confident in himself as ever? Did he actually get married to the girl he went on his bicycle to meet every evening in Bondeno, and to whom he was then officially engaged? Accolti, Graziella Accolti, I think she was called. Our generation has been buffeted about like few others. The war and all the rest of it obliterated a multitude of intentions and vocations no less resolute than those of Carlo Cattolica. And yet something tells me he is alive, is a surgeon as he dreamt of being, and that even though he left Ferrara when still a boy, all the same he ended up marrying his Graziella. Will we two ever meet again? Who can say? I realize that it's a possibility. But anyway, I can still see Cattolica's fine-featured, clear-cut profile to my right, precisely modelled as on a medal. He was tall, very thin, with lively black eyes set under arched, rather prominent eyebrows, and a forehead that wasn't high, but broad, pale, placid, very beautiful. It's odd, but the earliest image I have of him is likewise in profile. We both went to the primary school, Alfonso da Varonno, in Via Bellaria, even then in different classes. And one morning in the school courtyard in the recreation hour, I was struck by his way of running. He sped around the perimeter wall, moving his thin legs with the long, regular, scythe-like strides of the middle-distance runner. I asked Otello Forti who he was. "What? Don't you know who that is? It's Cattolica," Otello had answered, wide-eyed. He ran, I noticed, in a different way to all the others, myself included, as if nothing could distract him or force him to veer off course. He advanced calmly, looking ahead, as though he was the only one, he alone among all the others, who was sure of where he was going. Now we were sitting close together, only a few inches from each other, but a sort of secret border, a demarcation line, stopped us communicating with the relaxed familiarity of friendship. To begin with, to tell the truth, I had made a few tentative attempts. One morning during Latin classwork, I had asked him, for example, if I might, due to exceptional circumstances, slip the 2 fat volumes of my George's dictionary into the space under our desk reserved for him, for his books and exercise books. And yet the chill rotation of a very few degrees which Cattolica, in consenting, performed on the axis of his face, had quickly dissuaded me from any further requests of this kind. What else was I hoping for anyway? I wondered. Wasn't the social significance, the worldly uplift of our union enough for me? At primary school, every year from the 1st to the 5th, he had been the best pupil of the A class, not to speak of lower secondary school, where the teachers passed around his compositions in the corridors. Yet I too, allowing for a slip every now and then, had always been a part of the select top group. And so, being, as we were, the standard bearers of 2 historically rival factions, wasn't it better that we behaved precisely so, each of us remaining, to all intents and purposes, in our proper places? As a rule, we've displayed ample mutual consideration, the maximum respect and chivalry. Every now and then, after being tested, we'd return to our desk, graciously bestowing on each other smiles of approval, congratulatory handshakes, nevertheless anxious that Mazzanti behind us, who, being aware of the situation and scenting the chance to extract some advantage from it from himself, and Malagou, had soon begun his own register in which he accurately totted up the marks each day, hadn't made any errors, and had maintained that unwavering fairness and impartiality in his faithful record-keeping to which he'd laid claim. But then, during classwork, how precipitously those frail castles of opportunistic hypocrisy crumbled away. In such circumstances, no passage of Greek or Latin was hard enough to master that it could ever induce us to enjoin forces. Each of us would work on our own account, jealously and meanly avid of our own marks, even ready, just so as to owe nothing to the other side, to give in an unfinished or erroneous version. As I had foreseen, Droghetti and Camurri acted as go-betweens for Cattolica, and the distant advance posts of Boldini and Grassi. When time was restricted, when our teacher Guzzo, having raised his eyes from the proofs of some essay of his on Suetonius, would announce with a cruel smile that in exactly 2 minutes, and not a moment more, he would send out the excellent Chieregatti to collect the manuscripts of you gentlemen. You'd have to have seen it to believe with what impudent efficiency the telephone network of the A section was made to work. Goodbye then to any exchange of smiles and handshakes. Goodbye to any feigned comradely courtesies. The mask fell off. And when it fell, the irreprehensible face of Cattolica, pent up and twisted with factional striving, showed itself to me in all its hostile, hateful reality. Naked at last. And yet, even though I loathed him, I admired and envied him at the same time. Perfect in everything, in Italian as in Latin, in Greek as in history and philosophy, in science as in mathematics and physics, art history and even gymnastics. I was let off religious studies and didn't attend the lessons of Father Fonseca, but I had no doubt that even with the priest, Cattolica was impeccable. I hated and at the same time envied his mental clarity, the lucid working of his mind. What an addled klutz I was compared to him. It was true. Perhaps in Italian essay writing I outdid him, but not always, as there was a range of topics, some that suited me, some that didn't, and when an argument didn't appeal to me, there was nothing to be done. Then it would have been a fluke if I'd managed to get 6 out of 10. Perhaps I also outshone him in Latin and Greek orals after that initial skirmish. Guzzo had begun to warm to me, and reading Homer or Herodotus, especially Herodotus, he almost turned to me to elicit what he called the exact translation. But in the written exercises, especially in translating from Italian into Latin, Cattolica was decidedly better, recalling all the most recondite little rules of morphology and syntax, and practically never making a mistake. His memory was such that when tested in history, he could recite scores of dates without a single error, or in natural sciences, reel off the classifications of invertebrates to the enraptured Signore Kraus with the same sureness and nonchalance as though he were reading them from the textbook. God, how did he do it? I wondered. What was he hiding in his head, a calculator? And Mazzanti didn't hesitate. After such displays of mnemonic bravura, he was always prompt to mark down a 9 or even a 9+ in his ledger. And the worst of it was that it was often me who, turning round, would insist on that plus being added. But my sense of inferiority didn't derive as much from a comparison of our respective scholastic efforts as from everything else. First, his height. He was tall, slender, already a young man, and dressed in an adult fashion, in long grey vicufia trousers with non-matching jackets in heavy fabric, in the pocket of which would be a packet of 10 Macedonia cigarettes, an organdy cravat around his neck, while I, short and stocky, burdened with the eternal zouave trousers which my mother favoured. Beside him, how could I seem anything other than an undistinguished little boy? Then sports. Cattolica didn't indulge in any of them. He even looked down on football, and not because he couldn't play. Once in the churchyard of the Jesuit church, we'd improvised a kick around, and he'd shown what a stylish player he was. But just because sport didn't interest him, he considered it a waste of time. Besides, what course of studies would I pursue at university? I didn't know. One day I inclined towards medicine, the next towards law, the next again towards the arts, while he had not only chosen medicine, but he had decided between general medicine and surgery, opting for the latter. And finally, there was the girl he made love to, the young lady from Bondeno. In matters of love, I hadn't had the least serious actual experience. Would the summertime beach encounters I'd had with those young girls even count as experience? A little holding of hands, staring into one another's eyes, the odd furtive peck on the cheek, and nothing more. He, on the other hand, was officially engaged, with a conspicuous ring on his finger. Oh, that ring! It was a sapphire mounted on white gold, an important senatorial ring, especially displeasing. And yet, what would I have given to own one myself? Who knows, I thought to myself, perhaps to become a man, or at least to acquire that basic minimum of self-confidence, to pass oneself off as such. A ring of that sort would surely be an accessory, a great help. Who did he, Cattolica, do his homework with in the afternoons? At first I couldn't work this out. He seemed so self-sufficient, so aloof, that I was inclined to concede him no close friend. I thought that even his relationship with Boldini and Grassi was based on necessity, and that at his home in Via Cittadella, no school friend would ever be invited, not even them. But I was wrong. To tell the truth, I'd had an inkling some time before. That morning when, as the last one out, I'd gone down the stairs from the chemistry and biology lab, Krauss's exclusive domain, and then had suddenly seen in front of me that very trio, Cattolica, Boldini, and Grassi, halted on a landing in deep conversation. Seeing them there, I immediately guessed that they were arranging to meet up again in one of their houses in the afternoon. In fact, they quickly changed the subject, aware of my approach. They began talking about football. Just imagine it. As if I didn't know Cattolica had no interest in sport and would never discuss it. All the same, I wanted to be sure. I wanted physical evidence. So that very evening, not having found my father at the Merchants' Club, from the time I'd stopped studying with Otello, I'd taken to stopping in at the club almost every evening at about 7, I suddenly made up my mind. Instead of going straight home, I'd rushed off to station myself at the corner of Viale Cavour and Viale Cittadella. It was still some 20 minutes before 8. From the castle to the customs barrier, Viale Cavour sparkled with lights, while Via Cittadella, broad and stony, seemed steeped in a deep mist. I stood at the corner and stared towards the Cattolica's house, which was a couple of 100 meters away. It was a smallish, red, detached building, recently constructed, undoubtedly graceful, I thought, but with something tasteless about it. Weren't they a bit vulgar, a touch dubious, the pink curtains that adorned the lit-up second-floor windows? Some of those little houses in Via Colomba, where Danieli and Veronesi spent a good part of their afternoons behind closed shutters, gave a hint of something similar. I waited a quarter of an hour. I was considering leaving, having begun to suspect that they'd arranged to meet elsewhere, either at Grassi's in Piazza Ariostea or at Boldini's in Via Ripa Grande, when the street door opened and one after the other, the 3 of them, Cattolica included, trooped out. All 3 of them then went back up Viale Cavour on their bikes, slowly enough to allow me to step back from the corner unseen. Once there, however, the trio parted company, Boldini and Grassi turning left, straight towards the city centre, and Cattolica to the right, towards the customs barrier. Where was Cattolica off to? For a good while, I tracked him at a distance, my eyes glued to the back light of his shiny grey Maino bike. It was clear. He was going round to his fiancée's at Bondeno. But the idea that after a busy day of studying, the morning at school basking in universal approval, then the afternoon at home soothed by the admiration and affection of his closest friends, he could then award himself an evening session smooching with his fiancée, was suddenly unbearable to me. Chapter 3. Although Otello Forti had received an excellent report at the end of his first term, he wanted to spend no more than 3 days with his family: Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day. I hardly saw him, not until a few hours before his return to Padova, and by then he was already utterly taken up with the thought of leaving. I'd gone to see him at his house, number 24, Via Montebello. He had immediately taken me to admire the big, dazzling crib, arranged as ever in the ground floor drawing room. But as to its construction that year, for the first time in at least 10 years, none of his brothers had thought to invite me round to help. Then we went up to his bedroom. And yet, not even up there on the top floor, in that little room which I'd always considered somewhat my own, did I manage to make myself useful. As soon as I'd entered, Otello, with unfamiliar courtesy, had made me sit down in the armchair next to the window. Then he busied himself with packing his suitcase, and when I stood up to help him, he insisted I sit down again. He preferred to do it himself, he said. He'd get it all done much more quickly on his own. I did as I was told. In the meantime, I watched him. Without raising his eyes, he kept going back and forth to his suitcase with a slowness that seemed to me studied. I remembered him as blonder, chubbier, with a pinker complexion, and, perhaps aside from the long trousers that made him look slimmer, he had indeed lost some weight and grown an inch or two. But above all, in his eyes, behind the glasses he wore for short-sightedness, there had now settled a serious, solemn, bitter expression which pained and wounded me. It's true that he'd never been of an open disposition. It had always been me who took the initiative in everything, in our games, our bike rides into the country, our out-of-school reading, Salgari, Verne, Dumas. He, for his part, letting himself be dragged along, grumbling and resistant, but sometimes even laughing, thank heavens, and secretly admiring me, precisely because I managed to make him laugh every now and then. But now, what had changed between us? How was it my fault that he'd been failed? Why didn't he chuck that grudgeful scowl? What's up with you? I tried to ask him. With me? Nothing. Why? I don't know. It really looks as if you got something against me. Well, good for you, with all your equanimity, Otello had replied, with a brief notional smile that strayed no further than his lips. He was evidently alluding to my inveterate tendency to worry over trifles, my eternal need to have others like me, as well as to the change brought about in his character by misfortune. If that's what I wanted to do, I could keep on wasting my time with my usual childish whims. But not he. He neither had the time nor the inclination. Misfortune had made a man of him, and a man had to deal with serious things. I don't know what you mean, I replied, but I'm sorry, is this any way to behave? If you'd at least have written. It seems to me that I did write. Didn't you receive my letters? I did, yes, but... Well, then. He raised his eyes and gave me a hard, hostile stare. How many times did you write to me? 3 letters in the first fortnight, and then nothing after. And you? He was right. The first who failed to reply was me. But how could I explain to him at this point the reasons why I hadn't felt like dragging on a correspondence in which our roles had suddenly been reversed? I'd thought it was for me to console him for his ill fortune, and yet in some way it had been he from the start who'd had to console and chide me. Later, making the most of the day's mild weather, there was no comparison with the brutal winter of the year before. Regardless that the season was well advanced, the cold spell had still not dug in. We had gone down to walk in the garden. In the blue, slightly misty light of dusk, we had completed a kind of tour of the treasured sites of our friendship, of the lovely central lawn, now damp and patchy, where he and I, along with his brothers and cousins, had played many a game of croquet, of the rustic shed beyond the lawn, the ground floor of which served for a woodpile and coal cellar and its first floor for a dovecot, and finally of the wooded rise down there by the outer wall, on top of which Giuseppe, his older brother, had built a greyish hut, half worm-eaten beams and half wire fencing, once a chicken coop, for his rabbit breeding project. It was mainly Otello who spoke. He gave a sketchy account of his life at school, tough, certainly, he admitted, mainly due to the brutal morning call by the prefects. They had to get up at 5:15, and then all of them rushed down to the chapel. But cleverly planned, so that they couldn't sit around dawdling and always had something to do. The curriculum, much broader than ours of the year before. For Latin, they had to prepare the third book of the Aeneid, Cicero's Letters, and Sallust's Jugurthine War. For Greek, Xenophon's Cyropaedia and Lucian's Dialogue, and a selection of Plutarch's Lives. For Italian, I Promessi Sposi and Orlando Furioso. All of Orlando Furioso? I exclaimed. The whole lot, he replied dryly. But there was one question I was burning to ask him, and which I only managed to do in the doorway just as I was leaving. Have you made friends with anyone? To which he replied with evident satisfaction that yes, of course, he had got to know a Venetian boy whom he liked a lot, and they studied together. He was called Alverà, Leonardo Alverà. His father was a count, a good guy, and also good at Italian, Latin, and Greek, but especially good at maths and geometry, subjects, that was for sure, in which no one could compete with him. If every now and then I would dash off a poem, a short story, he, with the same ease, just for his own pleasure, solved the most complex equations. What a phenomenon! With a brain like that, who could tell what he'd achieve as an adult? Become a scientist, an inventor, in short, a Marconi. I can't be sure if what I'm about to tell you took place on the 8th of January, as we went back to school after Epiphany. It's likely that it did. In any case, one early morning, a half hour before the bell rang, I'd gone into the Gesù church, where I'd never before set foot. Whenever he was confronted with a tough bit of classwork or an important oral exam, Otello went there, as I put it to myself, to propitiate the gods. But I had only accompanied him as far as the threshold, and no further. The church seemed empty. I had slowly walked up the right aisle, gazing up and around like a tourist, but the sunlight which shone through the large upper windows stopped me from seeing the large Baroque canvases hung above the altar clearly. Having reached the transept, immersed like the rest in semi-darkness, I'd crossed to the left aisle, which was flooded with light. And there my attention was suddenly drawn to a strange gathering of motionless, and silent figures huddled beside the second of the smaller entrances. Who were they? As I came to realize as soon as I'd come close enough, they were not living people, but life-sized carved statues of painted wood. They were, as it turned out, the famous Pianzun de la Rosa, to which as a child I'd been taken many times, although not here at the Gesù, but at the De la Rosa church of Via Armari, by my Aunt Malvina, the only Catholic aunt that I had. Once again, I looked at the ghastly scene, the wretched, bruised body of the dead Christ stretched out on the bare ground, and around him, petrified in mute attitudes, in soundless grimaces, in endless grief never to be released in words, were gathered his relatives and friends, the Madonna, St. John, Joseph of Arimathea, Simon, Mary Magdalene, and 2 pious women. Looking again at this scene, I remembered Aunt Malvina, who never managed to restrain her tears at this same spectacle. She would draw her black spinterish shawl across her eyes, then kneel down without, of course, daring to make her little unbaptized nephew kneel beside her. Finally, I roused myself looking around before leaving. I spotted Carlo Cattolica down there, kneeling composedly in a pew off the central nave. My initial impulse was to leave him undisturbed and make off without being seen. Yet instead, with my heart beating hard, I went down the left aisle on tiptoe till I came level with him. He was praying with his satchel of books beside him, his pure, beautiful forehead leaning on his clasped hands, and proffering to my observing gaze the same finely chiselled, indecipherable profile that I would notice every day at school. Why weren't we friends? I wondered, tormented. Why couldn't we become friends? Perhaps he didn't respect me. No, it couldn't be that. Even if they were hard-working and bright, Boldini and Grassi certainly weren't better than me. Because of religion, then? No, it wasn't to do with that either. Our different religions had never cropped up between me and Otello. On the contrary, if anything, at the Fortis, even if they were all extremely pious and militantly active in Catholic organizations, the lawyer Forti belonged to the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and Giuseppe had also joined 2 years ago. No one had ever made me feel it mattered that I was Jewish. And Cattolica's parents weren't known to be especially churchy. So why was it? Why? Cattolica had got to his feet, made the sign of the cross, and then seen me. "Oh, what are you doing here?" he asked in lowered tones as soon as he had come over to me. I signalled with my thumb. I was looking at the Pianzun de la Rosa. "Didn't you know it?" "Only too well," I explained, having seen it on many occasions in the De la Rosa church as a child. And as we walked towards the statues, I held forth about my Aunt Malvina and her ruling passion, visiting all the churches of Ferrara. This information seemed to interest him. He wanted to know who this aunt was. Was she by any chance my mother's sister? "No, my grandmother's," I replied. "My mother's mother. She was called Marchi. Meanwhile, we'd walked out into the churchyard. It was a few minutes before 9, and both the churchyard and Via Borgoleone, especially in front of the Guarini school, were already crowded with youngsters. We were leaning against the red facade of the Gesù church, and as none of our school companions seemed to have noticed us, we continued our conversation. For the first time. The event moved me, made me garrulous, and stirred in me a need for friendship. We began to talk in general about religion, but then he asked me if it was true that we Israelites didn't believe in the Madonna, if it was true that according to us Jesus Christ was not the Son of God, if we were still expecting the Messiah, if in church we wore caps, and so on. And I replied to all of this point by point in a more than affable manner, suddenly feeling that his general, somewhat crude, not to say rude curiosity pleased rather than offended me, and was liberating for me. At the end, it was me who posed him a question. "Excuse me," I said, "but I mean, your family, have you always been Catholics?" His lips briefly stretched in a proud smile. "I would imagine so. Why?" "I don't know. Cattolica is the name of a town, a seaside town near Riccione, between Riccione and Pesaro. And Jews, as you know, all have the surnames of cities and towns." He froze. "You're wrong about that," he had retorted dryly, suddenly assuming a knowledgeable air. "It's true that many Israelites bear the names of cities and towns, but not all. Many are called Levi, Cohen, Zamorani, Passigli, Limentani, Finzi, Contini, Contini, Vitali, Algranati, and so on. What relevance does that have? I could just as easily cite an infinite number of cases of people with surnames that seemed Jewish, but actually weren't at all." At this point he had begun walking off, still harping on about this topic in an undertone. This let us, for once, slip through the school gates together, and then walk down the long corridor which led to our classroom, and finally to cross the room to reach our desk, each of us keeping pace with the other, like the best of friends. Chapter 4. I remember very well Luciano Pulga's arrival on the first Monday, after lessons began. Everyone had already taken their places. Mondays would invariably begin with 2 hours of guzzo, which were dedicated to class assignments, while he, the boss, often liked to idle by the big window at the end of the corridor till almost 9:15, immersed in apparent contemplation of the field that was growing wild at the foot of the Gesù church's apse, when at the doorway, instead of the gigantic form of the teacher, we saw appear the minuscule one of a blonde boy in a green pullover, grey, knee-length short trousers, and long, tawny socks. Who was he? Still, as he hovered uncertainly just inside the doorway, casting around his blue eyes the intense cold blue of mountain ice in search of a vacant place, I was immediately repelled by his hook nose and the stick-legged look of someone on stilts, and at the same time moved to pity by his anxiety to find a safe haven. I watched him, seeing no one next to Giorgio Bassani. Chierigatti was absent that day. He first tried to seat himself in the second desk of the first row. He was blocked. That place was taken, Selmy had quickly warned him. It belonged to someone absent, but who would be back tomorrow or the day after, and would certainly make him move. At which he instantly stood up again and moved away. Skinny, with a thin Adam's apple that trembled, half strangled, a little above his white shirt collar, he began once more to look around, having halted at the end of the girls' row, at the very desk which had remained empty since the start of term, when I'd occupied it in my stab at self-exile. He had once again walked down the aisle between the second and third rows with a measured and determined step, with the fixed gaze of someone who sees a sanctuary before him. But he was sweating. Droplets of sweat made pearls along the skin above his slightly retracted upper lip. And this detail, the drops of sweat, which I had noticed in a flash as he passed by, almost touching me, once again filled me with a vague sense of repulsion. I also clearly remember what happened when Guzzo returned to the classroom. He, the teacher, subjected the new arrival to a prolonged interrogation. "Good heavens! And who might you be?" he began. "Perhaps a visiting pupil?" The other replied to the despot, "Pulga, Luciano," displaying an easy, inveigling Italian, that of a travelling salesman, with a markedly Bolognese accent. The class obsequiously rewarded Guzzo's quips with gusts of laughter, and after a while I came to the aid of the poor creature, guilty of having come to school with nothing more than a fountain pen, not only offering him the regulation sheet of school paper, so that he could be permitted to do the classwork too, but also, swiftly following Guzzo's invitation, I made my way to the back row, so that Signor Pulga Luciano might avail himself of my dictionary. And finally, I remember the odd feeling I had throughout that hour and a half, spent side by side with him, with Pulga, the two of us busy trying to solve the puzzle of that Greek translation. Guzzo, while making me change places, "Seeing as you've scored top marks by lending him your foolscap," he said, "why not excel yourself by scurrying back to where you came from?" Had given instructions that the dictionary should remain on the desk, visible at all times, and placed exactly in the middle, to prevent either of us from copying. But Pulga copied away regardless, as and when he wanted. Taking advantage of the teacher's rare moments of distraction, he cast hasty, avid, sideways glances over the Schenkel, displaying such perfect technique, I thought, that it must have required years and years of practice, an extensive career. And yet the way he copied my work with such complete confidence, with such a lack of personal judgment, only keen to perform his own work of plagiarism without error, filled me with a complex, trapped sensation, a mixture of gratification and disgust, against from then I found myself defenseless, more or less incapable of any proper reaction. At the midday break, I found him close beside me. Could I come along with him to some bookshop? He asked me. At the Minghetti school in Bologna, which he'd attended, they mostly used different textbooks. So now, as though his father hadn't forked out enough in moving here, he'd have to buy almost a whole new set again. Complete disaster. If only he'd been able to acquire them one at a time, perhaps even on credit. Together we went up via Borgoleone in the wan January sunlight, and Pulga, meanwhile respectfully conceding me a place on his right, kept on talking. Despite the fact that Guzzo, during the lesson, had already elicited almost everything about his family and his scholastic curriculum, he chose to repeat for my sole benefit that they came from Lizzano in Belvedere, a small mountain town some 80 kilometers from Bologna, where his father, a doctor, had held a practice for almost 10 years, that he had gone to primary school in Lizzano, lower secondary in Porta Terme, and started upper secondary in Bologna, travelling back and forth on the train every damned day, and finally, that his family, the 4 of them, father, mother, and 2 boys, because of this unforeseen move into the Ferrara province, had fallen into serious difficulties. Just imagine, they didn't even have a house to live in. How come? I asked, astonished. You don't even have a house. So where do you sleep? In the Hotel Tripoli, in that big square behind the castle. I knew exactly what sort of hotel the Tripoli was. Rather than the hotel, it was a third-rate restaurant, frequented at midday by farm workers and street hustlers, and in the evening by those my mother would call women of ill repute. The bedrooms were situated above, on the 1st and 2nd floors, and the owner of the locale, small, fat, with a bowler tipped back on his crown and a toothpick between his gold-filled teeth, who in summer, in his shirt sleeves, almost permanently sat by the entrance, astride a kitchen stool, rented them out mainly by the hour, keeping the keys in his own pocket. True, it's not one of the finest hotels, Pulga continued. And by night, he sniggered, it seems to be busy enough. And yet, it's far from cheap. Do you want to know how much it costs a day for 4 people for board and lodging? I wouldn't know. 50 lire. Is that a lot? I asked, uncertain. A lot? Do the maths. 5 times 4 makes 20. That's 2,000 lire total per month. Fair sum, wouldn't you say? If you consider that my father is a local doctor in Coronello, earned a monthly basic salary of only 1,000 lire. I felt a wave of anxiety. And so how do you manage? Well, I said a basic salary of 1,000 lire. On top of that, though, there are home visits, operations, above all operations. But even then, in the country, people would prefer to die rather than shell out. Then take into account competition with the main hospital in Ferrara. Coronella is too close to the city. 10 kilometres is nothing. He suddenly stared at me with his steady, ice-blue eyes. But your father, what does he do? He's also a doctor, I said, embarrassed. But he doesn't practice. He doesn't practice? No. Every now and then he pays a home visit, but for free, for friends. A couple of times a year, he gets called out further afield. For circumcisions, I added with an effort. He didn't understand and turned round to look at me. But he caught on quickly. Oh, I see, that's it. So, I guess you live off a private income? I think so. At the Malfatti bookshop in Corso Roma, the textbooks he was searching for were all out of stock. They'd have to be ordered, the assistant explained, and given that the term was already far advanced, they wouldn't be likely to arrive for a fortnight. I was expecting this news to disturb him, but he appeared relieved, or so it seemed to me. He dried the droplets of sweat that the heat of the shop had once again formed above his lip with a small handkerchief, and left the assistant with the list of books. He'd call back in a fortnight, he said, and then went ahead of me towards the exit. He wanted to accompany me back to my house. It was nearly 1 o'clock. I tried to dissuade him, telling him how far away Via Scandiana was, and that if he went along with me, he wouldn't be back at the hotel before 2. "Oh, don't worry about that," he exclaimed, laughing. "Good thing about the restaurant is that you can eat when you want to." "You and your family don't eat together, then?" "Yes, we do, at least in theory. But partly because my father returns from the country only in the evening when he's finished his clinic, and partly because my mother is always out looking for flats. Well, in the end, we just eat together at supper, and that's all." "That must seem strange to you." He looked at me and laughed, jutting his protruding jaw sideways, a sure sign, according to my father, of a mauvais caractère. It was obvious that he envied me the order, the economic security, the bourgeois stability of my family, but it was clear he felt a slight contempt for me as well. Perhaps afraid that he might have given himself away, he immediately began to thank me effusively for my help over the classwork. "If I hadn't been there to give a hand," he said, "who knows how he'd have been able to manage? With teachers like Guzzo, it's obvious. First impression you give has enormous importance. But on that subject, why didn't I ask Guzzo to be transferred so I could stay in the back row on a permanent basis, or at least until he had got hold of all the textbooks? That Cattolica, whom I shared with, had the look of a very well-behaved, well-brought-up boy. No doubt he's clever as well, exceptionally so. And yet, it has to be said, he's not very likeable. Isn't he perhaps a bit stuck up? His way of behaving, of looking at people. Didn't it have a certain—" He interrupted himself. "I don't mean to offend you," he added, scrutinizing me. "Perhaps you're good, very close friends." I avoided his gaze. "No, not especially." "As far as the books were concerned," I continued, "he didn't have to worry. At school, I could always lend them to him. But as for moving to sit by him, I wasn't sure I could do that. I didn't get on that well with Cattolica, but we'd sat together now for 2 months, and just to drop him like that, all things considered, we were something of a tried and tested partnership. But who do you do your homework with? With him? No, I don't do homework with anyone. We had almost arrived. We left Via Madama by Piazza Santa Maria in Vado and turned down Via Scandiana. What was that kind of barrier down there at the end of the street? Pulga asked me as he kept on walking, and at the same time pointed towards the mist-covered prow of the Montagnone, at which it seemed Via Scandiana came to a halt. I stopped in front of the entrance to my house, pressed the bell, and turned round to explain to him what the Montagnone was. But he was already distracted by something else. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed in a serious tone. "It's a mansion." He stepped back to the centre of the street, keeping his gaze directed upwards. "Is it all yours?" "Yes." "Must have heaps of rooms." "Quite a few, including the first and second floor. There must be something like 50. "And they're all taken just by your family?" "Oh, no. We only live in those on the second floor. There are tenants on the first floor." "So you and your family live in 20 or so rooms?" "More or less." "But how many of you are there?" "There are 5 of us. My father, my mother, and we 3 children. That is me, my brother, Ernesto, and my sister Fanny. Then you'd have to count the maids." "How many of them do you have?" 2, and one more who works part-time." 20 rooms. Imagine the cost to heat them. And the tenants? At that moment, the latch of the door sprang open. I raised my eyes. My mother was at the window. "How come you're so late?" she asked, observing Pulga. "Come on in. Your father's already sitting at the table." "Good day, signora," said Pulga, bowing slightly. "Good day." "This is a classmate of mine," I said. "Luciano Pulga." "Very nice to meet you," my mother said with a smile. "But come on in quickly now if you don't want to make your father angry." She withdrew from the windowsill and closed the window, and yet Pulga had still not decided to go. He approached the big door, gently pushing one of its wings, and leant his head into the opening. "May I come in for a second?" he asked, turning. "I'd like to take a quick look at the garden." He silently walked ahead of me over the threshold while taking off his sports cap. Then, without taking his eyes off the door at the end, open onto the garden, he took another few steps on tiptoe. I watched him. He walked across the huge floor of waxed green and white tiles with those cautious steps of his, a little stiff-jointed, like a small, solitary March bird. He stopped. He kept looking around with his back turned to me, and in silence. My lips moved of their own accord. I said, "Would you like to come back to do your homework with me today?" Chapter 5. My mother was delighted that I'd made a new friend. She very much liked Luciano from that first afternoon. When she came into the study, not only did he stand up, but he even kissed her hand. The gesture won her over utterly. A short while later, in fact, returning with a pot of tea, exceptionally good tea, accompanied by toast, butter, honey, and blackcurrant jam and slices of ginger cake, she sat down to join us with this little feast, and her dark eyes caressed Luciano with maternal solicitude while she spoke. She had asked about him, his family, his father's professional duties, and, becoming anxious on behalf of his mother, busying herself from morning to night in search of an apartment, she offered any possible assistance to that end. Poor woman, she had sighed. Whatever she needed, she should phone her, please tell her to phone, and she would be more than happy to mobilize not only herself, but all her friends. "How pleasant your friend is," she said later at table. "Yes, he really is polite and well brought up." With that emphatic he, she was evidently alluding to Otello Forti, whom she, being jealous, had always found too coarse and sulky. Irritated, I didn't reply. It was true, I thought with my eyes fixed on my plate. Rather than stay at home, I had always preferred to go and study in Via Montebello, at the Forti's house. But so what? How was it Otello's fault that ever since Roncati, the teacher at primary school in Via Bellaria, had placed us next to each other in the first desk of the central row right in front of the teacher's podium, I had always preferred studying round at his house. As for hand-kissing and courtly shenanigans, Otello was an absolute non-starter. But he was genuine and sincere, perhaps too sincere. Signora Pulga telephoned, and my mother wasn't slow in relating what she and that lady had talked about. In a highly refined voice, wearied but very appealing, the lady was profuse in her thanks. She explained she had already found a house outside Porta, from where it was, along the road out to Bologna, via Coronella. That is, and as far as that was concerned, there was no need for any kind soul to trouble herself on their behalf. But her Luciano, how could they ever forget, she and her husband, all that we had been doing to help her Luciano? "Thank you, my deepest thanks, my dear signora," she concluded. "At the moment, no, as we still have to organize the furnishings, and you know how much it costs to keep things in storage. But in a fortnight, my husband and I would like permission to intrude on you with another phone call. My Oswald, as a doctor, would also very much like to make the acquaintance of your husband." "As a doctor?" my father grumbled, giving a faint, twisted grin. But happy, you could see, as he was whenever anyone remembered the subject in which he'd qualified. "More likely they'll be after some money." Dr. Pulga was not after money at all, at least not from my father. Some days later, having called round, without his wife, at our house, he immediately made his intentions clear. He had come only to get to know a colleague and to have a chat. He then began to talk about himself. He had studied medicine in Modena between 1908 and 1913. In 1914, he had married. From 1915 to 1917, he had fought on the Carso, and in 1918 at Montello. In 1920, due to a shortage of funds, he'd had to take on the practice in Lizzano in Belvedere, which, after almost 10 years in the most difficult conditions, he'd decided to leave to take up this practice in Coronella. It was obvious, he added, that as far as medicine was concerned, Ferrara and Bologna couldn't even be compared. But leaving aside Coronella's proximity to Ferrara, the Ferrarese medical establishment didn't at all seem, as it was in Bologna, to be controlled by a tight little mafia, and thus hermetically sealed against any infiltration. He himself knew, it could be said, of all the doctors in Bologna, from old Murri to Schiassi, from Negrasoli to Putti, from Neri to Gasbarini. He was even a family friend of the surgeon Bartolo Negrasoli. Of short stature, with a red face, cyanotic, and green rolling eyes with a hypothyroid aspect that glinted behind small lenses, Dr. Pulga, my father declared, wasn't someone who appealed to him. What a hideous way of talking. To claim to be a friend of this and that person in Bologna, an intimate of half the university and half of Sant'Orsola Hospital, and meanwhile to speak so ill of them, sparing nothing and no one. Bartolo Negrisoli, for example, perhaps the finest wielder of a scalpel in Italy today, had always been an anti-fascist. No harm in him remaining faithful to his own views. But to wish, as Dr. Pulga had had the chutzpah to wish, that he be thrown out of the Bologna school, where his teaching risked corrupting so many youths, and at the same time proclaiming himself a friend of him and his family, my word, that really was a disgrace. And to cap it all, what kind of behaviour was it? To pay a visit and remain sunk in an armchair from 3:30 till 8? For heaven's sake, make yourself scarce. If by chance Dr. Pulga were to call him on the phone, we had two choices. Either tell him he was out, or that he was ill in bed and couldn't move. But Luciano, what was Luciano like? The first impression of faint physical repulsion had certainly remained, and daily familiarity had not erased it. Although he was clean in both his person and his clothes, there was always something in him that perturbed me. It might have been the droplets of sweat that emerged among the blondish hairs above his upper lip at the slightest emotion, or the blackheads scattered more or less evenly everywhere on the waxy skin of his face, but denser around the temples and just under the nostrils, or the marked sideways movement of his jaw when he pronounced the letter Z. Or else, though I'm not sure, the calloused, yellowy hue that strangely covered the palms of his hands, which were thin and oversized, a bit like a hunchback's. But for all the rest, I have to confess that, especially in the beginning, his refugee-like humility, his total submissiveness, that as of an inferior under protection, gave me an almost inebriated sense of satisfaction. In essence, my relations with Otello had never been so easy. He accepted my superiority, but made me pay for it in countless ways, with his continual muttering, with his mulish stubbornness. If, for instance, he came to my house, and that happened rarely enough, he'd always do so sighing with ill grace. And here we had a fellow of a very different stripe, for whom my house, he even told me so, the very first day when I took him on a room-by-room tour of the apartment, was the most beautiful, welcoming, and comfortable place he'd ever seen in his life. My mother, the nicest and kindest mother of all, and myself a kind of prodigy of cleverness and brilliance with regards to homework, an oracle before whom he could only listen in silence and awe. Although he was neither stupid nor inept, for in the question and answer sessions to which he was subjected for a whole month by all the teachers, from Guzzo to Kraus, from Bianchi to Darzetti, and that one who taught history and philosophy, he had always defended himself tooth and nail, and, however reluctantly, even Mazzanti had been unable to award him a lower mark than 5. He left me free to unravel the knotty passages, dictate aloud whatever I decided I was right, and when I'd finished, limiting himself, while he was still writing it down in his notebook, in his big, neat, slightly angular, feminine hand, to exclamations of applause, such as, "Bravo! What a knockout! I've never seen anyone translate Greek so well. Lucky sod!" How relaxing, I would say to myself. What an easy life it is for Luciano Pulga. What a difference between him, who never needed to contribute. In practice, it was I alone who translated, so that if my mother had approached on tiptoe to eavesdrop behind the door, nor was it impossible that she did so, as I heard the parquet creak in the next room more than once, she would have heard only one voice holding forth, mine. What a difference between him and Otello, who, whenever he opened his mouth, it was to play the contrarian or devil's advocate. But leaving Otello aside, if I'd managed, at a certain point I was hoping to enter and be part of Cattolica's circle. Imagine what a struggle I'd have had. The rivalry that divided us at school, sharpened by the irremovable presence of his 2 cronies, Boldini and Grassi, would certainly have continued round at his. At Cattolica's house, yes, as for the place where we'd go to study, there would have been no chance of discussion, either his or solitude. Take it or leave it. Luciano would arrive every afternoon around 4 o'clock and wouldn't leave before 7:30 or 8. Yet it's not as if we were always working. Besides the half hour for tea, every now and then we'd stop to chat. This was always up to Luciano to decide, for it was he, suddenly energetic and commanding, who would impose those brief pauses which my poor, tired brain had need of, just as later, when he considered that I was sufficiently rested and relaxed, he would spur me on to further labours. During the intervals, he did everything to entertain me, distract me, even amuse me. He was greatly in debt to me for the protection I'd offered him from the first day, the books that I was still lending him, the hospitality of my home, the homework that, essentially, I did for him. And he, therefore, he seemed to be saying, repaid me with the modest but perhaps not contemptible gift of his presence, and with his spectator's role of egging me on. It wasn't much, little enough, that was true. But of one thing I could be sure, there was nothing more he was able to give. He was careful not to boast about anything. Very often he would declare that he was without any ambitions, happy to remain confined within the limbo of those who are suspended, he was quoting Dante, between a 5 and a 6, as he would add with a smile, standing out in one way or another, for good or for bad. One ended up paying the price. It was as if he was saying, I know I don't count for much, no, for even less than that. And yet the way he talked to me about school, for example, putting Mazzanti's fairness in doubt, he was sure that between me and Cattolica, he shamelessly favoured Cattolica. Or making me aware that down there from the back row, a lowly position to be sure, yet not without some advantages, he was afforded a much clearer and more objective vision of the whole class than I could have, involved as I was in the struggle, the competition, in the glorious but also petty daily slog of coming top. In every phrase of his I could perceive, as read, his determination to be useful to me, even indispensable. Confident that it would please me, he never missed an opportunity to speak ill of Cattolica. In his view, Cattolica was nothing but a conceited bighead. Leaving aside the present company, how could I really compare the intelligence of Boldini with Cattolica's, or even that of Giorgio Bassani? The fact was that Boldini didn't want to come top. Even being an underdog was a vocation, and even less than that would do for Bassani, who aspired to do nothing more than an average of 7. A plodder like Chierigatti, though better organised and cannier, that was all Cattolica basically was. And in fact Guzzo, who was by no means stupid and didn't let himself be dazzled like Krauss and Razzetti by mere feats of memory, when he sought out an answer a little out of the ordinary, usually left Cattolica well alone and was sure who to turn to. It's true I wasn't especially well disposed to scientific subjects, or, to be more precise, I only applied myself in subjects I liked, Italian, Latin, Greek, etc. But it would just have needed a little effort on my part. Only last year in the maths retake exam, hadn't I passed with a good 8? And he was willing to bet that even in maths, in physics and in natural sciences, that Signor Cattolica would be made to bite the dust. No, really, I don't think so. I weakly warded off the compliment. I've never been any good at maths. You've never been any good at it because you've never wanted to be. Maybe, but isn't that the same thing in the end? It isn't the same thing. Being able is one thing, wanting to is another. In my opinion, it's a question of the grey matter, of the brain's development just not being adapted to it. When I threw out that phrase with a smile, Luciano jumped up in protest. For me, of all people, to argue such a thing. The way he looked at me, serious, intense, and at the same time respectful, I understood that he was awaiting my permission to remind me of the mathematical genius of my race. My father, too, with an excellent head for figures, was convinced that we Jews were the best mathematicians in the world, attributing my scarce aptitude, seriously enough, to the peasant blood of my grandmother Maria. I pretended not to understand and let the topic drop. But he was right, and bit by bit he was becoming indispensable to me. With that in mind, I remember one afternoon towards the end of February, when because of the snow he was late for our meeting. Unexpectedly, the snow had begun to fall in the morning around 9:30. How beautiful and moving it was to see from inside the classroom the small, silent flakes as they slowly fell against the blackish background of the Church of Gesù, and then on leaving to find Via Borgoleone entirely mantled in white. It caused the usual festivities. At the school gates, a big snowball fight broke out, during which Luciano and I utterly lost sight of each other. But it didn't matter, as it was understood that at 4 o'clock we would meet up as usual. After lunch, rather than abating, the snowfall became heavier. At 5, oddly uneasy, I was already wondering if Luciano would have been able to make his way on foot from the remote district of Foro Boario as far as Via Scandiana. Perhaps today he might not manage it, I said to myself, looking out of the window. Perhaps it would be better if I started my studies alone. I sat down at the desk with my notebook and with the textbook open before me, but I couldn't concentrate. The Pulgas still needed to install a telephone at their house. Yet if Luciano had really meant not to come, it was reasonable to suppose he could all the same have found some way of warning me, bothering to walk to the chemist's 50 metres away to phone me. Whenever there was any urgent need, the Pulgas made use of that facility. He'd told me that himself. At 5:15, I stood up again and went to the window once more. Outside it was already dark, and if I were to go to Luciano's house, and it would have been the right thing to do. I opened the window. I leant out, breathed the air, and looked down. The snow continued falling, but more feebly now, reduced to a kind of dust dancing weightlessly around the yellowish street lamps. Down in the street, an immaculate blanket of snow, compact and even, had covered and softened every protuberance. Neither the cobbles nor the curbs could be distinguished any more. And then, down there, while my heart was beating madly, beating with a joy mixed as ever with its opposite. I suddenly made out Luciano himself as he swiftly slipped inside the gate at that very moment.